No. All right, so for our presentation this afternoon, we're still out in rural Canada, but in a different neck of the woods in western Newfoundland and Labrador. Yes, so you're going to take a trip to, I've always wanted to go there, I long to go there, yeah. In rural communities, the church has been often the lifeblood of the community, or the village, used to be anyway, and it's what holds the community together. But what happens to communities where there aren't resources to have full-time or even part-time pastoral leadership? Gloria Gaynor's 1978 pop hit, "I Will Survive," you know it, is a favorite and enduring theme song for keeping on in the face of adversity as much as we can. I won't sing it, but you know.
I can.
You can sing it? All right, good. But our presenter this afternoon is Katie Flynn, and Katie is a final year Master of Divinity student from Forteau, Labrador. She's an Anglican postulant, ordinate, thank you, in the Diocese of Western Newfoundland, and her project is We Will Survive. Let's welcome Katie.
So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for coming here today. I'm really excited to be here and to see everyone who is here today. My name is Katie Flynn. Some of you know me, some of you don't, and my research project is titled We Will Survive. We Will Survive. Stories of Congregations Without Priests. So today I'm going to be presenting data from interviews conducted with 4 active Anglican church members from across Newfoundland and Labrador. And their churches, because of financial struggles, have not had a full-time priest for at least 2 years. So I'm wondering, how many people here know of a church that doesn't have a full-time clergy? Can I see a show of hands? Wow, that's a lot more than I thought I was going to see. But if you look around, there were quite a few hands up. The reality is congregations are aging, rural populations are declining, and churches are struggling financially. So I grew up, as you've heard, in rural Labrador, and I care so much about rural ministry. I really do. I know people in congregations that they're crying out and they're fighting for ministry, they're fighting for services, they're fighting for their community. They're fighting for their church. And so I wanted to take a closer look at this issue that I've heard so much about. So I posed the research question, what is the experience of rural congregations without a priest in Newfoundland and Labrador? So that's what I was looking at. So what is their experience? What can it teach us? And what I wanted to get a look at are what are the needs of the people in these communities in this situation? So this research isn't meant to critique church leadership and congregations. What it's meant to do is gain a deeper knowledge of the people's reality and spiritual needs. That's what we really want to look at, is what's going on there, and how can that inform the church leadership and congregations? So the methodology I used, what this is a qualitative research study, and I use a narrative qualitative research method. So what that does, it's a method that focuses on the information that's been provided by the people that I've interviewed. And the data that I collected is organized as a chronological story. So story of a series of events or actions. It takes a look at the larger narrative. So the research examines the participants' experience over time. So as you can see in the image, we're looking at a time from when the parish had a full-time priest, so when they continue on what I'm going to be calling this in-between time, so there's no priest or someone coming in maybe once a month to a whole jumble of different things. And then on to part-time ministry, which 3 of the 4 participants are in, and the 4th participant is moving towards part-time ministry in the congregation. So we're going to take a look at this larger narrative. But first, let's set the scene and talk a bit about what the literature has to say about the topic. The Doctrine and Worship Committee of the Anglican Church of Canada wrote in 1987, they were acknowledging in talking about this issue that long-term solutions consistent with the primitive church norm lie in the future. A temporary solution is needed right now, which will make it possible for those who desire to be fed by both word and sacrament on a regular basis. And the truth is, every single person that I've spoken to, all the people I've interviewed, they desire to be fed by both word and sacrament. They really want this on a regular basis. The participants in this study are receiving a temporary solution. There's no evidence of a long-term solution or a discussion about being more like the primitive church that was predominantly lay-led, so led by the people in the congregations, the people in the church. In the book, Where 20 or 30 Are Gathered, Peter Bush and Christine O'Reilly talk about the importance of educating and supporting and encouraging lay people to get involved while recognizing and encouraging the gifts of others. This is a really important element that's going to come up as we get into the data, and I agree that this is really, really important. So to support, to educate, and encourage lay readers, lay leaders. And the data that I've obtained from the interviews is consistent with all the literature I've read. This is only a snapshot of what I've looked into over the past 6 months. So both the literature and the research shows that there's a need for vision and transformation within the church. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to the 4 people that I got to interview. And they belong to small congregations in multi-point parishes in Newfoundland and Labrador. And each person chose a pseudonym name for themselves. They chose it themselves. So I'm going to introduce you to my 4 participants. Meet Richard. Richard is a treasurer in his church and in his parish, so in his congregation and parish. Jacob, that we have here, is a lay reader, so he leads services along with his wife regularly. John is a church warden, and Mary is a lay reader who leads services, and as well she plays the organ and does a lot of the outreach work. So these are my participants, and all 4 are heavily, heavily involved in the church life. They're the go-to people in their church when there's no priest. They're the people make the call and call up. And they've journeyed from, all of them have journeyed from this full-time into this part-time ministry model. So there are several main themes that emerge, and as I was going through this narrative, and I'm going to look at 3 with everyone here today. And so the 3 things we're going to look at are financial concerns, what ministry really looks like, and the hope that the participants find in the narratives. So full-time ministry is what we're going to start with in the narrative. Full-time ministry consisted for my participants of larger congregations, more people attending. There was lots of music, there was a choir, worship was great. Every week they had worship. There were programs offered, there was education offered, and there were many groups, men groups, alpha, all sorts of things on the go. And the congregations were really alive and well. However, things changed after the parish could no longer afford a full-time clergy. So there was a point where finances decreased and they could no longer afford a full-time clergy. And this is when this in-between stage begins. Jacob explains, then we couldn't get nobody, and we went half-time. We were half-time for a little while with nobody. And then you got a priest coming in, just doing services on Sunday, and you don't get that same feeling in the church because it's just make do. The churches all went through this period of time when the clergy would be filling in maybe once or twice a month, and it wasn't always the same clergy. They'd have a minister come in, and then maybe a different one come in the next, just once a month. And people I interviewed, they weren't accustomed to doing without communion or clergy weekly. And it's in this in-between time that the congregations were left with really what they called the bare essentials. They're left trying to survive. There's no real leadership there. And I mean, how can congregations meet assessments, meet their financial demands, meet what they have to pay to the diocese with only one service a month? That's when people give a lot of the money, is actually in the service, although they do go around and collect money from different parishioners. So they feel disconnected from the clergy that are coming in. They're feeling this lack of leadership. My participants talk about this. And there isn't a regular service to keep them going, to keep people attending, and they no longer have the same energy or the same numbers. It's not there. They don't have the same numbers. So the absence of a clergy deeply, deeply impacts them. It really does. The one thing I did want to mention is they do talk about the support that they receive from their diocese. So the diocese does support them. They feel they can call up people at the office and say, I have this question, I have this concern. They did mention that that's there. But there still is this lack of leadership. So what happens actually is, in this in-between time, participants took on larger leadership roles. So John, Mary, Jacob, and Richard talk about all these new leadership roles that they take on. They talk about enjoying the work tremendously and thoroughly, and they emphasize the love they have for the work that they're doing, and they continue to do in the church. It gives them meaning in life, and they enjoy it and want to continue. Jacob says, unless I was retired or something, I could really get into it a little more. And Mary explains, I only wish there was more as a layperson that you could do. She said, I've enjoyed it, but it comes to a point where you wonder, is this what God is really expecting of me? Does God want me to carry on doing this? As I listen to their stories, they remind me of the early church, when community churches were predominantly lay-led. They were led by people in the congregation. So Paul would spend some time there with the people, and then he'd leave and be in contact through letters, but mostly the community churches were led by the people. C.K. Barrett, in his book, Church, Ministry, and Sacraments in the New Testament, he talks about the reality of the early church. And one of the scriptures he references is Romans 12, 6-8. If your gift is prophesying, then prophesy in accordance with your faith. If it's serving, then serve. If it's teaching, then teach. If it's to encourage, then give encouragement. If it's giving, then give generously. If it's to lead, then lead. And he continues on. And here Barrett reflects on this and says that Paul's not just talking about their offices. He's not talking about bishops and deacons and priests like we have in the Anglican Church. But it's focusing on the gifts of all the people. So John, Mary, Jacob, and Richard have their own gifts, and that make them a part of the body of Christ. That Paul's speaking of in 1 Corinthians and in Romans. And what Barrett is doing is he's challenging the paid ordained ministry today and reflecting on the early church. He explained that, well, even Paul worked for a living, right? And so did the followers of Christ. They were asked to do unpaid work. And so that's what my participants are doing. They're giving their time, they're giving their energy to the church the best way they can. And often they talk about taking on a lot of the responsibilities of a clergy if the clergy were there. So they're kind of moving towards this model of the early church. However, they don't see it through these lenses. They don't look at it like that. And even though they're taking on these leadership roles, participants don't actually want this. They enjoy the work they're doing, but they don't actually want this. And they talk about this. They prefer a full-time clergy. They want direction. They want leadership to help them, especially with the things they struggle with, because they talk about things that they struggle with. Mary calls some of the work she has to do a burden that ends up being left on her, the burden of taking on the position of the clergy. Richard explains, I deal with a lot of stuff that I'm not qualified to deal with sometimes. So they kind of remind me of the 12 disciples, regular people that are choosing to follow Christ. Certainly not always prepared or ready, but they're doing their best. And the disciples had Jesus for a time, helping them, trying to teach them, trying to prepare them. But it doesn't appear that the interviewees are being prepared. It doesn't appear that John, Mary, Jacob, and Richard are being prepared or taught or receiving the help they need to take on the leadership roles required of them in the absence of a clergy. So there's this fear that they also have too regarding what might happen if they get sick, if they get to a point where they're not able to take on these roles. They don't see anyone else taking them up. And so this worries them. They have fear around it. But they keep saying, well, we try not to dwell on this and we keep on working. We keep on going. So there comes to a point along this narrative where the parish and the diocese decide to move into what they call part-time ministry. And what this is part-time clergy coming in rather than a full-time. So it's hello part-time ministry, and they also call this hello half-time ministry, is a way they use to describe it. So what is part-time ministry, you might ask? Richard explains it as a 3-day commitment. So the clergy is in charge of the Sunday service and then 2 other days for parish duties. So this would include also presiding for weddings, for funerals, home visits, home communions, and so on as required. He also explains that ministry is just now the bare essentials. Jacob says, the parish is in like survival mode. The only thing we do is services on Sunday, and there's nothing else. There's no Bible study, there's no prayer group, there's nothing like that going on in the parish. So it's just survival mode. For these participants, as a church transitions into having a part-time clergy, it transitions into the bare essentials of ministry, and it's about trying to keep the church alive. It's about trying to survive. 3 of the 4 participants spoke about the negative effect of having worship, only once a month, combined with missing things like Bible studies, a choir, a large congregation, alpha, men's groups, and pastoral visiting. And so the truth is the part-time clergy with 3 days a week just doesn't have time to do this, just isn't able to do all of this. And it may sound like this sad picture of depleting or ministry kind of reduced to Sunday worship with finances decreasing and everything declining and kind of going downhill. I know it sounds like a sad picture. And the participants actually do mention this, that this is partially the reality. And it's also how a lot of people in their churches understand it. So a lot of people around them do understand it this way. However, there's this select few in the church that choose to carry on and persevere. So there's always a group of at least 4 or 5 of them. And in their church, Richard, John, Jacob, and Mary are among these people. Richard writes, the result is fewer people to do more work. And he also explains, I guess when we realized the severity of the situation, we just jumped in there, a small handful of us, and we try to keep it going. And they kept it going, all of them. Their identities seem to be centered around survival, and they understand that this is their ministry. So all 4 of these people are faith-filled people that are working very hard, despite their discouragement, to continue to do what they feel God is really calling them to do. The biggest thing that does come up is the financial struggles across all interviews. They spend quite a bit of time talking about this. It's an integral part of the narrative. Mary explains that it's an awful thing to have to say because it's not what God would want, but money is the thing. Money is the thing keeping us down, And Jacob rationalized, about the only benefit, if you can call it a benefit for the parish, is their assessment is not so high. Richard said he was warned of this by a church official. If you're going part-time ministry, then look out, because there's one pitfall they describe, and I witnessed it. And here it is. The transition to part-time ministry, another phenomenon occurred. People adjusted their yearly contributions by 1/2. And needless to say, this defeated the whole purpose of part-time ministry. So for many people, the understanding of part-time ministry by the entire congregation really impacted the amount of people that were attending church, the financial giving, and the general energy and morale. And for a lot, it was viewed as the last straw, and people thought it was the beginning of the end for their church. They really did. And my participants did believe it a bit themselves, but it wasn't going to stop them from doing all that they could, and they really emphasized this. They had hope. As Richard often said, just keep going, gotta just keep going, we're just keeping going. And all the participants, they would prefer to have a full-time clergy. They'd prefer to have a full-time minister, a rector, a priest. But money is this huge factor and stressor in the congregations, and the participants end up feeling the weight of this problem. And right now, financially, it's just not possible. And yet they have this relentless hope the entire time. So they bounce between this discouragement and this willingness to persevere, this willingness to keep on going. Richard explains that we have this small group of us become a more determined group of people, more determined than ever to keep our church open as long as we can. He also says that we can't get discouraged. We got to keep going. If we get discouraged, there's no one. And Jacob states, I want to see what I can do here. And I think that's what the Lord has called me to do, to stay here and keep fighting for my own parish. The hope they have reminds me of a lot of what Jürgen Moltmann has to say in his book, Theology of Hope. He's talking about an eschatological hope. I know it's a big word. He says, in actual fact, however, eschatological means the doctrine of Christian hope, which embraces both the object hoped for and also the hope inspired by it. So my understanding of what he's talking about is we hope for the kingdom of God. We hope for Christ's coming. But we're not focused on that, okay, that's happening in 2 years or at some specific time. But it is the hope. And that hope for Moltmann should inspire us in the now. And so Jacob and Mary and John and Richard are hoping for something that they can't see, that they don't know, and it is inspiring them in the now. Moltmann writes, hope statements of promise, however, must stand in contradiction to the reality which, at present, be experienced. So how can one hope for something that already exists? If you have it now, how can you hope for it? What he's saying that it isn't possible. To hope is to be in contradiction to the present reality. So I really think this is the hope in the people that I interviewed. Mary explains, we keep working like little dogs, to keep things going, but it's hard, it's really hard. And I mean these towns. I think they're closing churches in this province. But you'll never see the church close. And Richard states, we know we're not going to turn it around, not in our lifetime. We know that. But it makes us more determined than ever to do what we can do. That's all we can do. John shares, I did worry, having the outcome being closing our church. I would never want that to happen. And Jacob's discouraged. He says, the negative part, people just stop going, and the givings are down, and 'tis no one to guide them, 'tis no one to keep them going. Their spirituality is dropped. And so all the negativity comes from not having a full-time priest. The four really do agree that the only benefit of not having a full-time clergy is that their assessment is lower and they can meet it. But what can they do? Should they succumb to their discouragement and fear? I think perhaps this persevering hope is about living out their faith in the best way that they can, offering all that they can, and perhaps it's connected with a greater hope in Christ. They feel called to this ministry, and so they carry on living and surviving. So this is a small sample study, and what you've heard is just a snapshot. Like Colin said earlier, you can't fit everything into a presentation, and it is a complicated situation, and congregations, parishes, and dioceses are really doing the best they can to respond. So after analyzing the data and diving into the experiences of John and Jacob and Mary and Richard, I have some recommendations. And in fact, the participants have their own recommendations that they shared. So we're going to start with that. Richard suggested that if a congregation was considering part-time ministry, they should have information sessions with the entire congregation before making a decision. So he wants them to lay out the pros and the cons and the possible pitfalls of part-time ministry. He thought, because what happens is they usually meet with the parish council, but they don't always meet with everyone in the congregation. And he said, before we make a decision, before anything happens, we want to know what we're getting into. And so maybe that would help, if we knew what we were getting into and what part-time ministry was about. And he wishes that he had that in his parish. Jacob explains, if a parish is without a full-time priest for very long, I hope that the bishop of any diocese will not make a parish part-time. Keep it full-time, even if there's neither priest to go in there, but keep it full-time. In Jacob's situation, a conflict in the church had actually led to the decrease financially, and one of their churches had to close, and so that's what led them into this mode of part-time ministry. So that's the aspect that he's speaking from. And in John's situation, they're amalgamating parishes together. So they're forming this new parish with full-time ministry as a way of addressing these issues. It's full-time ministry, but it's shared between the two parishes as they become a new parish. There's no simple solution to the financial struggles of these parishes. They value the role of the priest. They really, really, really want a full-time clergy. They would love to have a full-time clergy. And a lot of them, even the people in their congregations, are contented to have a part-time clergy because they've gone through that in-between time where they've had no one. And to have services regularly twice a month with the same priest, they can become contented with that as well. But they do realize the value. And the options and suggestions that the participants presented are really valid and worth taking into consideration. Dioceses need to be more proactive and less responsive to the problems that arise. The literature talks about this, my participants talk about it. There's a gap, and the following things are what they're really looking for as they continue to hope. The congregations are looking for guidance, they're looking for education. So educate parishioners before they make a decision. This is a little bit about what Richard was talking about. Before the full-time clergy leaves, this is what I would recommend. Educate them. Talk about what part-time ministry entails. It's clear that in this period where there's no one, or a scatter priest coming in maybe once a month, that this is a vital time, and maybe if they had some education prior, it could help them get through that time and into part-time ministry. It might help someone step up and provide the leadership that's needed, or for them to feel prepared. It could also help ensure that attendance and financial givings continue. So the second thing I'd recommend is to equip and encourage lay readers with more training, support, and tools they need to take on these leadership roles. So if the finances are decreasing in a parish, maybe look at how do we build up the lay people in our how do we build up the congregation so that they can take on the leadership roles that they're going to have to take on in the absence of a full-time priest. So be proactive and less reactive. After training and support after that happens, so in that time that my participants are in, they'd really benefit from some extra training and support. I think we need to encourage this kind of hope that John, Jacob, Richard, and Mary have. And I think we need to discern a variety of options. It's not a cookie-cutter response. It's an incredibly complicated situation, and only some elements of those issues arise in this presentation. There's not some simple solution. There's not a cookie-cutter answer. It requires discernment. It does. And if there's anything I've learned from the participants and learned from the literature that I've read, is that we need to be more proactive and not reactive. These are not isolated cases. I saw the hands that came up earlier. There's quite a few people who know of places that no longer have full-time clergy. It's the reality of the church today. It's not just in the Anglican Church, it's across denominations. So I'm really convinced and I'm encouraged by Mary and John and Richard and Jacob's stories. We will survive. I have hope for these congregations that with discernment and support and education, struggling parishes can be thriving rather than just surviving. Thank you.
I'm really glad to hear that they really, really, really want clergy. They really, really want priests. Yeah. Questions and comments for Katie?
Thanks, Katie, for the great presentation. I really liked all your pictures.
I think that's our own art word, is it not?
Yeah. It is.
One of the things that I was thinking of was if lay people who have full-time jobs or part-time jobs are taking on more leadership roles within the parishes, then they're probably letting go of some of the things that used to go on in the parish, which you touch on. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, if they're letting go of those things, what are those things? What's left? And what kind of vision of church is then left? How are they living out church with each other?
Thank you. Good question. They actually don't spend a lot of time talking about anything that they've given up. They talk about it being very busy if they have jobs. Some of them are retired, of my participants. But those that aren't say it's hard to manage with a job and the things they have to take on. They wish they could take on more, but they're taking on as much as they can. In terms of ministry and some of the things they've spoken about happening that stop happening, so like the men's groups, the Bible studies, those sort of things, they speak about this as the role of the clergy. So they don't see it as their own role or as them taking it on. They say, well, that's the clergy's role. If we had a clergy, they'd do that. But there's no mention of them wanting or feeling called to take on some of those types of ministry. Hope that answers your question.
Katie, you talked a little bit about lay readers taking services and taking on other responsibilities. What about pastoral care? Were people in the parishes getting any kind of pastoral care at all, or if there was someone doing that, did they have any training at all in it, or what was that side of things like?
So only one of the participants talked about pastoral care, and that was Mary. So Mary says that she does visits. She goes and visits people who are sick, sometimes in the hospital, and she didn't talk about having any kind of training. And in fact, she talks about not always feeling prepared or equipped or knowing if she's saying the right things or doing the right things. A couple of the other participants did mention missing that connection, missing being able to sit down and talk with the clergy, missing that visiting and support for themselves. So they find a gap and they wish that they had a clergy that would come over and visit and they could talk about things more and discern things more. With Jacob actually goes to another parish for some of his needs. So he'll go to a different parish. He has a spiritual director, but he can't do that within his own parish. So there's one about an hour away that he'll drive to and receive some care and pastoral visiting for him there. Thank you.
Katie, there's an obvious sense of part-time ministry or ministry without a priest as being something less than church. Somehow there's an important ingredient missing in however people understand church. Mm-hmm. I wonder to what extent that is almost cultural, in the sense that these are communities that are losing an awful lot of community infrastructure in other places, not just the priest that they can no longer afford. There's a whole lot of other community infrastructure that's disappearing in a lot of rural communities. You made some reference to the study by the Doctrine and Worship Committee, which sees something like this as sort of an interim phase, a transitional or temporary phase. Is there any sense at all in people having gone through this experience or going through this experience that there is in fact another model that is something that could be embraced rather than simply mourning a model that's no longer financially viable? Is there any sense of growing into that, or still is this, I mean, amongst the people whom you talk to anyways, a matter of mourning what was rather than what can be?
Thank you. They are mourning what was to some extent, and they become discouraged by some of the things that are going on. None of the participants actually talk about what's going to go on in the future. They say our doors might have to close, but we can't think about that. That's a major theme throughout all of the 4 participants. We can't think of it. We just got to keep going. What else can we do? So they see it as a reality that they think the model of what's going to happen maybe eventually could be that their church doors close, or that their parishes become amalgamated. So they talk about saying, oh, well, there's that church about an hour away and another church about another hour away, and maybe we're going to have to come together. But they talk about a lot of pain in doing that, and they are still connected to their congregations. So they don't want to leave the small church that they're a part of. At the same time, they speak about knowing that we might have to leave that little church and all come together. We might have to come together like the schools, like other places are being regionalized. And so they see that as a potential future, but they also see that as a loss. And they talk about not focusing on it too much so that they can continue doing all that they can so that they can still keep this hope and keep this energy going. And they all still hope and wish for the older model of full-time ministry as well.
Darlene.
Katie, I want to celebrate your work in Newfoundland and Labrador. I think we need more people writing theologically about what happens there. And I'm captivated with Mary's comment. I think it was Mary who said, it'd be nice to do more if we were allowed to do more or encouraged to do more. And I'm wondering what that means and what the implications might be as you see it.
I think that the participants, Mary and also others, really want to do more. Some are hoping, like, yes, retirement. When I get retired, I can put my all into this. But this conversation about them not feeling equipped all the time, not feeling prepared, they talk about situations where they're giving different hampers or things to people in need in the community, where they're like, should I? I don't know if I should have done that. I wish I had some leadership. I wish I had someone I could call. And even though they didn't ask for this, I see it as something that they would probably open and receive, is to have some training and some support. So maybe some formal support from the diocese for people who are in these situations and taking on leadership, or perhaps some training that could be offered. It's interesting because, which I didn't mention, because you can only mention so much I didn't bring up, is that Jacob talks about feeling called to be ordained. And so how he kind of like, oh, I'm going to put that down and worry about that later. He does talk about it. So he said, sometimes I get in arguments with God about it. Some people here may have experienced that too. So he feels this call, but he feels like the need is so great in his parish that he feels like he needs to be there. And one option that some of the literature mentions is, what if we raised up local people and ordained them so that they could bring the sacrament and word there? But the reality of having to leave and go study is something that concerns him at least, and may concern other participants if they have to leave and study. Thank you.
While I'm walking over here, what happens with the sacraments? Not being Anglican myself, who does that? Do you have to bring in somebody?
Mm-hmm. So they would have a priest come in once a month in that in-between stage to have communion with the congregations once a month. So they might have some lay-led services in between, maybe. Jacob and Mary are lay readers, and so they would provide services sometimes, but they can't provide the Holy Eucharist. And so once a month they have a clergy come in and do that. When they move to part-time ministry, they say that it's supposed to be in all the points they're supposed to have communion each week. However, they can choose to do something different. And so all of my participants are in one of the smallest churches in their multi-point parishes, and they've opted to have the part-time clergy come in once or twice a month instead of all 4 weeks, because they can't get enough people to attend each week.
But that's quite a change from a tradition that's used to
Yeah.
the Eucharist at, at all their services. Okay, sorry.
So this is actually leapfrogging off of the discussion that you've just been having. At the end of your presentation, you talked about one of the implications being structures and programs in place to train and support and raise up lay leaders in the congregation, in the communities. Did you, from your interviews, did you catch any hint or any signs that this is something that is being considered, that is being planned, that, no? Okay.
Thank you, but no, I didn't, unfortunately. The one thing they did mention, they said, well, it's good. They said, if I ever have a question, if I ever need anything, I can call the diocese. I can call the people there, the bishop, the executive assistant, and they're happy to take my call. They're happy to listen to my concerns. And they did find that the clergy were happy that we're there to be of a support for them. But there was no mention of any formal training happening. I mean, they did, the other thing I will mention is when they had a full-time clergy, that's how the participants did get involved. So how their leadership began to increase, how they started to do things, is because they had a full-time clergy that really encouraged them. And 2 of my 4 participants got involved later in life after they had retired. They got really back into the church. And that involvement increased after the priest left. So they may have had some training while the full-time clergy was there, but I haven't heard of anything after. Thank you, Kate.
Do you feel that they have a good grasp of part-time ministry, or are they still living with the reality of perhaps part-time ministry with the dream of full-time ministry for part-time pay? Because that is, I'm United Church, I'm not Anglican, but that's one of the struggles we have with congregations or pastoral charges that are going to, their reality is they can afford only part-time ministry, and some of them not even half-time. But what they really want is somebody to be there every Sunday, and then when you present the concept that, well, if that person's going to be here only 1/3 of the time, and they're working in another parish or charge 45 miles away, and they expect them every Sunday, and then the other one is further away than that, we don't supply a broom to travel on. You know, they're not going to be able to do that. So is your sense of their belief in part-time ministry, do they have a good grasp of what that involves?
At first, the people in the congregations didn't at all. Only one, thank you for your question as well. Only one participant mentioned the congregation having that understanding. So there were a couple people in one congregation that said, well, we still want all these things. But actually in all 4 of the interviews, they talked about how when they moved to part-time ministry, they saw it, oh, it's half-time. So we're only going to go half the time, we're only going to give half the amount of money, it's only going to be half, because all we're getting is half. This isn't the understanding of my participants. My participants have worked really hard to try to break down that understanding, to say, Richard especially, because he's involved with the finances of the church. Richard, instead of each year coming out with a financial statement, he says every quarterly, every 4 months or so, he comes with the numbers and he says, look, yes, we don't have a clergy, but that doesn't mean we have half the expenses. We have part of the expenses gone, but actually there's still a lot that we have to cover. And if you keep cutting this, we're not going to have anything. So he made an extra effort. He sent out things in the mail. He had meetings. Once he got a grasp on what part-time ministry looked like financially and got a grasp on how the congregation was seeing it, he said, okay, well, we've got to educate people, so I'm going to let people know at least financially what this is. But there's not a vision of maybe what it could be or how they could be thriving. The other thing that happens is the clergy in a couple of these congregations don't live in the actual town, so they only come in for a couple days. So they've gotten used to that. And the third thing is that they're really happy, most of them. John talks about it at first. He said, we got full-time ministry now. And I said, you have full-time ministry? Am I doing the right interview? I wondered at first. I'm supposed to be interviewing people with part-time ministry or no full-time clergy. And John said, well, no, we get 2 services a month or so, and we're with another parish, but it's the same person and they're there often. And so they see it actually as such an improvement from that in-between time where they had no consistency, where it was kind of all over the place. And there's some bit of hope that, there's like 2 things going on here. There's this bit of hope that now we have someone, and this is good enough. At least there's someone to bury our people. At least there's someone to marry us. At least we're getting communion fairly regularly. At least there's this. And then there's also a large portion of the people who say, well, this is just the beginning of the end. We're in part-time, our church is just eventually going to close, this is it. So there's a whole bunch of different understandings in there of what part-time ministry is and what it means. Thank you.
Katie, did anyone in your conversations talk about shared ministry with another denomination?
No, not about shared ministry, but only in one instance they spoke about having someone from the United Church would come in and do the music sometimes. They didn't have anyone to play the organ, and so if they didn't have a service at the same time, they come in and play the organ, and they really appreciated that ministry being offered. Among clergy, there was no discussion of that, but with music, it was. Music's such an essential part for all of them. It doesn't come up in here, but music, all of them talk about wanting to have a choir and really missing the choir and that in worship.
So no history in the area of denominations worshiping together, even in service of the word?
I think there was 1 or 2 mentions of maybe special occasions where that could happen. So around Christmas time, around Easter, where there would be occasion, but it wasn't prominent in the interviews. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more here.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Following on the last question, I was thinking about David Foote's Boom Bust Echo when he was talking about shift in demographics and talking about taking that into account in planning sort of any sort of infrastructure. And single floor schools, for example, that were built for safety of the children, perhaps could be appropriate for transformation into seniors facilities. I'm just wondering, not so much sharing with other denominations, but perhaps sharing with other types of facility in the same small community, if that might be a potential source of income.
I don't know. They didn't mention that. Perhaps. There's one thing that I found out that I thought was really interesting. They talk about one time we had this many people in our church, and now we only have this many. And if you don't prompt with more questions, they leave it at that, as if. And I said, well, has the population in your town changed? And one of the towns they live in, it was something like 150 at one point, and now it's down to 50 or 60 something. So the demographics have changed, but there's little discussion about how the building might be used or how the infrastructure could be used.
I missed this person back here, so we'll let her have the last say.
In terms, can you hear me?
Can you hear
I'm
me now?
thinking in terms of how the expense for the priest can be shared, or what could the church do to generate revenue. So I'm thinking, if you brought in a priest, instead of the priest being just the priest for the church, could the priest become a shared resource for other areas in the community? Could the priest be the priest for, say, the fire department, as well as the police department, or the hospital? So you could have a shared expense.
Thank you for your question. Do you have something else, Kat?
Pardon?
Oh, I thought you were going to say something else.
No, I'm just thinking that, we have hospital chaplains here that are paid by the government. So could that priest take on a role that might be partially paid by the government?
I'm not sure that the way that the participants have described it, I'm not sure they have those things in their community. Right, if you're talking about a town with 50 people, I keep picturing a place called Capstan Island near where I grew up.
Could you combine communities?
So to share a priest between different parishes, different churches?
Well, not only between parishes, but within the communities.
Yeah, so they could do that in the sense that they're considered to be the priest for the entire community. So a priest is whatever area that they have to cover, they're considered the priest for that entire area. And so that would be the understanding in the Anglican Church. So if you're in Halifax, is maybe not a good example, my town, Fordo. If you're the priest for Fordo all the way to Capstan Island, then you're the priest for everyone and everything in that area. You are the priest.
So is it fair that the financial burden falls strictly on that parish?
It would fall on that parish and the people that do give money. Really interesting is one thing that Mary had mentioned. Mary said she's from this mining community, and Mary said, well, the mining, they used to give us so much money. The mining town did. I'm not sure if people would, or if people would invest money into the church in that way, but if they saw, perhaps, I don't know, if they saw that the church was doing something in the community that was of great value, that maybe they'd financially contribute or support in that way, perhaps. Thank you for your question.
And we have one response right here, and then that's it.
I'm going to address the menu of Western Newfoundland. I spent time, I grew up in a community that my family were the lady. But the menu of Western Newfoundland is chances are the only thing left that marks the community is the church. So it's an RCMP station. Well, I lived in St. Anthony. So the RCMP station was for St. Anthony and covered most of the 400 kilometers to the Trans-Canada. So they had a hospital, but in that whole strength down the northern peninsula, there is no hospital. That's it. You go there or Corner Brook, 5 hours away. So to share resources, you probably don't even have a school that you can run because the school has been moved out. So that's just my comment. The menu of living in that area is the vestiges of the church of what we're hanging on to.
This is a great conversation. And I got people raising their hands all over the place back here. But I think our time really
I'm going to mention one last little thing, and that's just to clarify, because the participants are from all over Newfoundland and Labrador, not just Western Newfoundland. And there are 3 dioceses in Newfoundland and Labrador. So there's 3 different governing church bodies: the Diocese of Western Newfoundland, the Diocese of Central Newfoundland, and the Diocese of Eastern Newfoundland and Labrador. So I just wanted to clarify. And so participants are from all 3 dioceses.
Thank you. I have really learned a lot about this area. Thank you so much, Katie. Let's give her a hand.